The temperature had not yet dropped to killing cold on the morning of January 14th, 1888, but it would. Everyone in Dodds Hollow knew it would. They could feel it in the way the air had stopped moving 3 days ago, the way the sky had turned the color of old pewter and stayed that way, flat and heavy and indifferent, like a lid pressed down over the world. Sheriff Harlan Dodd was burning his desk. Not the whole desk. Not yet. He had started with the chair legs, then the cabinet drawer, then the lower shelf of the bookcase where he kept the territorial law manuals he had never once opened. Now he was working on the desk itself, prying the side panel loose with a crowbar, feeding pieces of his own office into the small iron stove in the corner, like a man dismantling his own life one board at a time. Which, in a sense, he was. The coal had run out 4 days ago. The woodpile behind the jail had lasted 2 days after that. The town of Dodds Hollow, 412 souls according to the last census, was now burning everything it could find. Fence posts, wagon wheels. The pews from the Methodist Church had gone in 2 nights ago, carried out by Reverend Agnes Holt herself, who had decided that God would understand and the living needed warmth more than the dead needed ceremony. Harlan Dodd was 57 years old that January, and he had lived in Montana Territory for most of his adult life. He had seen hard winters before. He had seen cattle freeze standing up, seen rivers lock solid in a single night, seen men lose fingers and toes, and sometimes more to the cold that came down off the Canadian plains like a wall of white silence. He thought he knew what cold was. He had been wrong. The great blizzard of January 1888 was not like other cold. It was a cold that had intention. It pressed through the walls of buildings that had kept families warm for a decade. It crept under doors sealed with rags and blankets. It turned breath to ice before it left a man's lips and made the simple act of existing feel like a negotiation that the cold was winning. Dodd fed another board into the stove and watched the flame take it. The silver star on his chest caught the firelight and threw it back in small, mean flashes. He had worn that star for 11 years. It had started to feel like something he had stolen rather than earned. Some days it felt very heavy. Today it felt heavier than usual, and he did not examine why, because he was a man who had long ago learned the particular discipline of not examining things that were better left unexamined. He did not hear the horse at first. The wind had dropped to an unnatural silence 3 days ago, but the cold itself made a sound, a low and constant pressure against the ears, and he had stopped distinguishing it from other sounds. It was Deputy Roy Elkins who opened the jail door and let in a blade of frozen air, and said quietly the way a man says something he isn't sure he believes, "Harlan, you need to come out here." Dodd put down the crowbar. He pulled his coat tighter and followed Elkins out onto the porch. There was a woman sitting on a gray Mustang in the middle of Main Street. She was leading 3 pack mules, and the mules were loaded with firewood. Real firewood. Split logs, dried and stacked and tied with rope. More firewood than Dodds Hollow had seen in a week. There were also canvas bundles that looked like they might be food, and blankets. She sat straight in the saddle despite the cold that was killing everyone around her. Her copper-red hair braided tight and flat against her coat, her eyes moving slowly along the street the way a person looks at something they have studied from a distance for a long time and are now finally seeing up close. Dodd stared at her. She looked at him with gray-green eyes that held something he could not immediately name. Not anger, not warmth either. Something older than either of those things. Something that had been patient for a very long time and had finally stopped needing to be. "Sheriff Dodd," she said, her voice carried in the frozen silence the way voices do when there is nothing else moving in the world. "I hear you're running low on wood." He squinted at her. The face was familiar in the way that something seen in a dream is familiar. The structure of it, the set of the jaw, the particular stillness around the eyes. He knew that face. He knew it from somewhere he had put away a long time ago in a drawer he did not open. "Who are you?" he said. "Where did you come from?" She let the question sit in the cold air for a moment. "My name is Whitfield," she said, "Clara May Whitfield. You signed a by death certificate 5 years ago." Harlan Dodd felt the cold enter him in a way it had not managed to do in 4 days of blizzard. Not through his coat or his boots or the gaps around his collar. Through something deeper. Through the part of a man that knows, when the bill finally arrives, that he has always known it was coming. She watched his face go the color of the sky. She had imagined this moment many times over 5 years, standing at the mouth of her cave in the Badlands, watching the smoke rise from Dodd's Hollow and thinking about what she would say when the time came. She had imagined many versions of it. This was the only one that mattered. "As you can see," Clara May Whitfield said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite satisfaction, but was close enough to it. "The reports of my death were somewhat exaggerated. But to understand what that moment meant and what it caused and what it was built from, you have to go back. Back 5 years to a spring morning in April of 1883, and a family that was falling apart at the edges and looking for something to blame. The Whitfield family had come to Montana Territory in 1880 with a wagon, a prayer, and a plan that made more sense in Ohio than it did anywhere west of the Missouri River. Ezra Whitfield, Clara's father, was a big man with a big voice and the particular confidence of someone who has never been proven wrong because he has never stayed in one place long enough for the proof to catch up with him. He had tried farming in Ohio, cattle in Kansas, a hardware store in Nebraska. Each venture had ended the same way, not with disaster exactly, but with a slow fade, a gradual diminishment, until the family packed what was left and moved on to where nobody knew the story yet. Montana was supposed to be different. Montana was going to be cattle ranching on a real scale, the kind that built dynasties. Montana had land, more land than a man could see the end of, and Ezra Whitfield intended to fill it. What Montana actually had, at least on the particular stretch of it where Ezra staked his claim, was hard winters and dry summers and grass that looked lush in spring and turned to brown wire by July. The cattle came, and some of them died in the first winter, and more of them did in the second. And by the third winter, the herd that was supposed to build a dynasty had been reduced to 11 animals, 3 of which were too old to be worth feeding. Clara May was the oldest of the 3 Whitfield children. She was 19 in the spring of 1883, which meant she had spent 3 years watching her father's plan collapse and her mother's hope follow it. She had 2 younger brothers, Thomas and Cale, ages 14 and 11, boys who had their father's confidence without yet having had it tested. Clara had watched, and she had understood things about the failing ranch that the rest of her family had not allowed themselves to understand. She understood that the cattle were dying because her father refused to learn from the land. He ranched the way men ranched in Kansas, which was not the way anything survived in Montana. She understood that the dry summers were not bad luck but patterns, and that patterns could be read if you paid attention. And she understood, though she could not have said exactly when the understanding arrived, that her father had a secret he was keeping, and that the secret was connected to the visits from the man in the brown suit who arrived from the east twice that spring and sat with Ezra in the barn with the door closed for long, low-voiced conversations that ended when Clara came within hearing distance. She had tried to listen once. Her father had found her crouched by the barn wall with her ear against a crack in the boards and had taken her by the arm and marched her back to the house with a grip that left bruises and a warning that left something colder. "You mind what's yours," he said, "or I will mind it for you." Clara had a habit which her family called willfulness, and which she understood as something closer to self-preservation, of disappearing into the hills when the ranch became too small to breathe in. She had been doing it since their first year in Montana, walking east toward the broken country where the Badlands began, following the draws and coulees into a landscape that everyone else in the territory called worthless. She had started those walks because they were away from the ranch and away from her father's voice and away from the particular sound of her mother's silence, which was its own kind of sound. She kept going back because the Badlands were honest in a way that the ranch was not. They did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. They did not promise things they could not deliver. They were difficult and strange and utterly indifferent to what anyone thought of them. And Clara found, over the months of walking, that she respected this. 2 years before her family abandoned her, she had followed a line of steam rising from a crack in the earth. It rose straight up in the cold morning air, this column of vapor, from a narrow fissure in the rock about 3 miles into the Badlands. Clara had climbed down toward it carefully, feeling the rock grow warm under her hands as she descended, which made no sense in a November morning, and which therefore compelled her forward with the particular draw of a thing that contradicts what you think you know. She found a cave opening barely wide enough to squeeze through that opened on the other side into a chamber where the air was warm and smelled of minerals, and something ancient and deep, something that had no name in any language she knew, but that communicated with absolute clarity the presence of enormous time. She was sitting in that chamber, amazed and very still, when a voice behind her said, in English that sounded like it had been learned from books rather than people, "You are trespassing on my home, young woman. Most people who trespass have the decency to knock." Mabel Runningwater was somewhere between 65 and 75 years old, which was itself remarkable given where and how she lived. She was Crow, and she had been living in these hills for more than 40 years, since the time when the reservation lines had been drawn, and she had looked at them and decided that the lines were someone else's idea of her life, not her own. She had refused to go. She had simply walked into the Badlands and disappeared, and the people who might have come looking had eventually concluded that the Badlands had swallowed her, which was in a manner of speaking true, except that she had arranged to be swallowed comfortably. The people of Dodds Hollow knew of her only as a rumor, a ghost story, an old Indian woman who had gone mad in the hills. They called her Stone Smoke because of the steam that sometimes rose from the rocks near her cave. They did not go looking for her. The Badlands did not invite visitors, and even if they had, most people in Dodds Hollow had already decided that anything beyond the Badlands edge was not worth the trouble of discovering. Mabel Runningwater looked at Clara with eyes that had been watching things for 70 years and said, "You are not supposed to be here, but you are here, so you might as well sit down and stop dripping on my floor." For 2 years after that first meeting, Clara came back whenever she could slip away from the ranch. She came in spring when the hills were still cold and the steam from the vents rose high and clear. She came in summer when the Badlands baked under a white sky and the caves below stayed cool and quiet as held breath. She came in fall when the light went sideways and golden across the eroded spires and the shadows stretched long across the coulees. And she came in winter, which was when Mabel Runningwater had the most to teach her, because winter was when the geothermal system revealed itself most clearly, the warmth rising through the rock to meet the cold pressing down from above, and the cave sitting between these forces like a kept secret. The old woman was not gentle. She did not explain things twice. She showed Clara a thing once and then expected her to remember it, and if Clara forgot, Mabel looked at her with an expression that communicated disappointment more effectively than any words could have. But she was honest in a way that Clara, who had grown up around her father's practiced confidence and her mother's careful silences, found startling and then essential. Mabel said what was true. It was a quality so rare in Clara's experience that it took several visits before she fully trusted it. "The earth here is different," Mabel told her during their second winter together, crouching at the edge of a hot spring where the water steamed even when the air above it was 10 below zero. "Long ago, this was fire. Volcano fire, deep earth fire. The fire went down, but it did not go out. It is sleeping. Down below us right now, far below, there is fire. And this water, and that steam, and the warm rooms under the rock, that is the fire breathing. If you know where to stand, you can use the breath." She taught Clara the cave systems. There were 3 main chambers connected by low passages, and the largest could hold 50 people with room to move. She taught her which vents released heat consistently and which ones shifted with the season. She taught her where the hot springs surfaced in side chambers, keeping the water above freezing year-round. She taught her how to read the mineral deposits around a vent's edge to measure its heat output without touching it, and how to navigate the cave passages in complete darkness by the sound of the walls when you struck them with your palm. She taught her that the temperature in the main cave never dropped below 55 degrees even when the world above froze solid. "This land is not worthless," Mabel said once, with the particular flatness of someone correcting a lie they have heard too many times. "It is worth everything. The people who say it is worthless are people who only know one kind of value." Clara carried all of this back to the failing ranch, and she said nothing about it, because she had already learned that the things she understood were not always welcome in that house. The man in the brown suit visited the Whitfield Ranch for the 3rd time on March 15, 1883. Clara watched from the barn loft as he and her father stood by the fence line with a map spread between them. The man pointing and her father nodding, with the particular nod of a man agreeing to something he is not entirely proud of, but has decided he can live with. They stood there for nearly an hour. The man left in the early afternoon in the direction of the railroad line to the east. Her father came into the house and announced at supper that they were leaving for Oregon in 2 weeks. It was not discussed. It was announced. In the Whitfield household, these were different things. Clara waited until her brothers were in bed. She found her father in the yard, smoking the pipe he only brought out when he thought no one was watching, which meant when he was thinking about something he didn't want anyone to know he was thinking about. The bowl of the pipe glowed orange in the dark. The April wind moved through the grass with the sound of something whispering a word you can almost make out. "Who was that man?" she said. It was not a question. Her father looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him calculating, the way he calculated everything. What could be admitted and what needed to be managed. "Railroad man," he said finally, "buying up grazing rights in the territory." "He wasn't buying grazing rights," Clara said. "He was buying the land. Our land. You sold it." Ezra Whitfield's face did what faces do when someone says the true thing out loud in the dark. It went very still. Then it went hard, the way a man's face goes hard when he has been caught and has decided that the best response to being caught is to become more of what he already is. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I know what a deed transfer looks like," Clara said. "I know what a survey map looks like. I know you've been planning to leave since last fall, and you waited until you had the money from the sale before you told any of us. I know that map he had was not a grazing map. The sections were wrong. The boundary lines were property lines, not usage lines." Her father was quiet for a moment. The pipe had gone cold in his hand. "You're going to Oregon," he said, "all of us. That's what's happening." "Then why did you sell it first?" Clara said. "If we were all going together, why sell the land to the railroad instead of just leaving it or selling it openly at the land office like anyone else would?" What followed was not a conversation. It was the end of something that had been ending for a long time, the final collapse of a structure that had been weakening for 3 years of failed cattle and dry summers, and a father who could not admit that the land had beaten him. He said things that a father should not say to a daughter. Clara said things back that were true, which made them worse in the way that true things said in anger always make situations worse, even when the truth is necessary. Her mother came to the doorway and stood there listening, and then went back inside without a word, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how this would end and where she stood in the accounting of it. 2 weeks later, on the morning of April 3rd, 1883, the Whitfield family loaded their wagon for Oregon. Clara helped them load it. She told herself she was helping because it was the practical thing to do, and because she did not know yet exactly what she was going to do instead. And helping meant she was still present, still part of the family, still a person with a place in the world until the moment she wasn't. Her younger brothers moved around her with the uncomfortable energy of boys who sense that something is wrong but have been instructed not to ask about it and have complied, as boys that age do, by simply pretending the wrong thing is not there. Her father gave her a horse, the gray mare, older but sound, the one Clara had been using for her Badlands trips. He gave her the rifle she had been using since she was 12, a Winchester that she could field strip and clean in the dark. He gave her 3 days of food in a canvas sack, enough for exactly 3 days if she was careful, and for 2 if she wasn't, and both of them knew how long 3 days of food lasted in Montana in April, when you had nowhere to go. "We'll be back in a week," he said, not looking at her, adjusting the lash on the wagon cover with the focused attention of a man who has found something very important to look at. "Just going to the fort for supplies." Clara looked at the loaded wagon. She looked at her brothers positioned carefully on the far side of it, occupying themselves with nothing. She looked at her mother sitting on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap and her eyes directed at the middle distance, the particular posture of a woman who has made her decision and is waiting for the consequences to move past her. "All right," Clara said. She stood at the edge of the property and watched them go. She raised one hand as the wagon pulled away, a small automatic gesture, the kind of thing you do when people leave even when the leaving is a permanent kind. Her father did not look back. Thomas did not look back. Kel, the youngest, turned once and looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not cruelty and not indifference, but something that would take her years to name correctly, which was the look of a child who knows something is wrong and has been told, in 100 small ways, that his knowing does not matter. Her mother looked back once, a quick, sharp glance there and gone that Clara read clearly. Not apology, not regret, something more complicated and less honorable. The look of a woman who has chosen and knows she has chosen and is not asking for understanding. The wagon went around the curve in the road and was gone. Clara stood there for a while in the April wind. A hawk turned in slow circles over the far ridge, riding something invisible, patient and unhurried. She waited to feel something large and devastating, the kind of grief that announces itself with force. What she felt instead was a strange, cold clarity, like the feeling of stepping out of a dark room into morning light. It was not a good feeling exactly, but it was a real one, and it was hers. She waited 1 week, then 2. On the first day of the third week, she stopped waiting and started doing. She packed what she could carry on the gray mare, the rifle. The food, long since gone, replaced by dried meat she had made herself during the 2 weeks of waiting, working methodically at the task the way Mabel had taught her, treating the waiting time as preparation time, which it was. A blanket, a knife with a good edge. Her small notebook, a habit she had developed from Mabel Runningwater, who kept records of everything in a cramped, careful script, and who had explained once that a thing unrecorded was a thing that belonged only to the moment that produced it, which was the same as saying it would be lost. Clara had been keeping her own records for 2 years. Notes on the cave systems, the vent locations, the hot spring temperatures at different seasons, the cave routes and their landmarks, the plant life near the geothermal areas, and the careful distinctions between what was edible and what only looked edible. Everything Mabel had taught her, written down in a hand small enough that a page held more than most people would expect. She rode east into the Badlands without looking back at the ranch. She had said her goodbye to the person she had been there. She was riding toward the person she intended to become. Sheriff Harlan Dodd came looking for her 3 months later, in July of 1883. He did not come out of concern. He was not a man who spent his concern on people who could not return it with something useful. He came because the Whitfield family had posted a notice in the Helena Weekly Herald asking for information about the disappearance of their daughter, Clara May Whitfield, age 19, copper-red hair, gray-green eyes, last seen in the vicinity of Dodds Hollow, Montana Territory. There was a reward offered, $25, which was not a large amount, but was enough to make the posting worth reading if a man happened to have an interest in the matter beyond the money itself. Dodd had such an interest. He had been approached in late May of that year by a representative of the Montana Central Railroad, a man named Stokes whose job title was land acquisition agent and whose actual job was considerably more complex than that title suggested. Stokes had explained the situation with the directness of a man who assumes correctly that he is speaking to someone who already understands how these arrangements work. The railroad had acquired land rights in the Badlands Territory from a private seller, a Mr. Whitfield, before that family's departure for Oregon. The railroad's geological survey team had identified the geothermal features of that territory as potentially significant. The railroad's interest was in maintaining the territory's status as uninhabited and unclaimed while their development plans proceeded through the appropriate channels. "There's a girl," Stokes said, "Whitfield's daughter. She's been spending time in those hills. She may still be out there." "Maybe," Dodd said. "It would be better for everyone if she weren't," Stokes said, "or if she were determined to be unable to make any claims on that land." The implication was clear. Stokes left a sealed envelope on the table when he stood to go. Dodd looked at the envelope for a long time after Stokes walked out the door. Then he picked it up and put it in his coat pocket. That was the decision, made not with words, but with the weight of an envelope in a coat pocket on a warm May evening. So when the reward notice appeared in the Herald, Dodd rode into the Badlands with Deputy Roy Elkins and a third man, a ranch hand named Cutter, whose last name no one seemed to remember, and whose function on this expedition was to make the search look thorough without being thorough. The Badlands east of the Yellowstone were not designed for searching. The coulees cut deep and random through the landscape. The rock spires threw shadows in every direction, disorienting the eye in the sense of distance. The terrain folded back on itself in ways that made a man feel he was covering the same ground repeatedly, even when he wasn't. After 3 days, Dodd had found nothing. No body, no bones, no evidence of a living person or a dead one, nothing except eroded rock and the particular silence of country that has seen many things and retained none of them. On the second day, Roy Elkins found something. Elkins was 40 years old that July and had been Dodd's deputy for 4 years. He was a careful man, a man who paid attention to ground the way men do when they have spent enough time in wilderness to understand that the ground keeps records. He found what he was looking for in a soft patch of earth at the mouth of a narrow coulee, where the spring rains had softened the surface enough to hold impressions. Horse tracks, not old ones. The stride pattern of a walking horse, the depth of the impression suggesting a rider of moderate weight, the direction heading deeper into the Badlands. He stood looking at these tracks for a long time. The tracks were fresh enough to tell him the horse had come this way within the last week, fresh enough to be followed, fresh enough to mean that Clara Mae Whitfield was alive. He looked back up at the ridge where Dodd was picking his way along the broken rock, and he thought about the conversation they'd had the night before, sitting by the fire after Cutter had gone to sleep. Railroad company needs this territory clear of complications, Dodd had said, not looking at Elkins, turning a stick slowly in the fire with the calm of a man discussing something unremarkable. The Whitfield girl's father sold them the land rights. If there's someone still living out there, someone who was there when the deal was made and knows what was in it, that's a complication. A living girl in those hills is a problem that doesn't go away. A dead girl is a closed file. Simple. Final. Elkins had said nothing that night. He said nothing now, standing over the fresh tracks in the soft earth. He made the decision that he would spend years trying to understand and the rest of his life unable to escape. He covered the tracks with his boot, moving carefully, pressing the soft earth flat until the pattern was gone. Then he walked back up to the ridge and told Dodd he had found nothing. Dodd came back from the Badlands and called it done. He stood up at the next town council meeting, which was held in the saloon because the council chamber needed a new roof that no one had gotten around to fixing, and he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "The Whitfield girl is dead," he said. He said it with the flat authority of a man who has checked and confirmed and has no remaining questions about the matter. Found evidence of wolves, nothing left to bury. Case closed. He found no evidence of wolves. He found nothing at all. He collected the $25 reward from the newspaper fund the following week, put the money in his coat pocket, and walked out of the Herald's office into the July sun and deliberately turned his thoughts to other things. He was skilled at this, at the particular discipline of not examining what had been decided and could not be undecided. It was a skill that had served him in smaller matters over many years, and that would serve him now in a larger one. He signed the death certificate for Clara Mae Whitfield, age 19, cause of death listed as exposure and animal attack, date of death listed as approximate, April 1883. He had Elkins sign it as witness. Elkins's hand was not entirely steady when he wrote his name. Dodd noted this and said nothing. Some things were better addressed by silence than by acknowledgement. The certificate went into the files. The files went into the cabinet. The cabinet sat in his corner of the jail office, against the wall, solid and ordinary. The kind of furniture no one notices because it has always been there. It sat there through all the seasons that followed, through the railroad's arrival in 1885, through 3 more winters and 2 dry summers, and the gradual transformation of Dodd's Hollow from a struggling frontier town into something that aspired to permanence. It sat there while the silver star on Dodd's chest grew heavier with each year, in the way that things grow heavy when you carry them without examining what they contain. And somewhere in the Badlands, in a cave that stayed 55 degrees while the world above it turned to ice, a 19-year-old girl who was officially dead spread her map of the cave system on the warm stone floor and began planning her first winter. She did not know what Dodd had decided. She did not know about the death certificate, or the wolf story, or the $25, or the envelope Stokes had left on the table. She did not know about Roy Elkins standing over her tracks with his boot raised, making a choice that would weight itself on him for the rest of his life. She would know all of it in time. She had a habit of learning things people did not want her to know. She had a notebook. She had patience. She had a cave that stayed warm no matter how cold the world above it became. And she had something else, something she could not have named precisely in that first summer of her new life, but which would become, over 5 years of silence and watching and waiting, the most powerful thing she owned. Something that grew in the absence of people who expected things from her, in the quiet of a place that asked nothing except attention and honesty and the willingness to learn what it had to teach. She had time, and she had the discipline to use it, And in the end, those two things together would prove worth considerably more than a silver star in a corrupt arrangement with the railroad company. The temperature outside the cave was dropping toward winter. Inside, the geothermal vent breathed its deep earth warmth through the stone floor, steady and reliable as a heartbeat, completely indifferent to the cold above it, completely indifferent to the human decisions that had been made about the land above it, completely indifferent to everything except the ancient fire far below that had been burning since before the first human being had stood on this ground and decided it was worthless. Clara May Whitfield, age 19, officially dead, pulled her blanket around her shoulders, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and began to write. She wrote about the cave dimensions. She wrote about the vent locations and their heat output. She wrote about the plant life near the hot spring and the careful distinctions she had already learned and the ones she still needed to learn. She wrote about her food stores and her estimates for how long they would last and what she would need to do when they ran low. She wrote for 2 hours by firelight while the world above her froze. Then she closed the notebook, set it beside her, and looked at the warm stone ceiling of her home. She had survived today. Tomorrow she would survive again. And the day after that, if she paid attention and made good decisions and kept learning, she would survive again. It was, she thought, enough to begin with. The first winter nearly killed her twice. Not from cold. Cold was the one thing she had solved, or rather, the one thing Mabel Running Water had solved for her before she ever needed it solved. The cave stayed 55 degrees when the world above dropped to 30 below, and 55 degrees was cold enough to need a fire for comfort, but warm enough to survive without one. Clara had a fire anyway, built small and careful at the mouth of the main chamber, where the natural draft from the geothermal vent pulled the smoke out and up through a crack in the rock that she had spent 2 weeks locating and clearing of debris, learning as she cleared it which cracks connected to which passages and why the smoke moved the way it did in different weather conditions. The first near death came in late November of 1883, when she ran low on food and decided to supplement her dried stores with plants she found growing in the warm, mineral-rich soil around the hot spring in the side chamber. She had watched Mabel gather plants in that area during their visits. She had taken notes. She believed she knew what she was doing. She was wrong in a way that took 6 days to finish being wrong, and that she was very lucky to survive. The plant she chose looked correct in every detail she had recorded. The leaf shape was right. The stem color was right. The way it grew in clusters near the water's edge matched her notes exactly. What her notes did not record, because Mabel had not yet reached that lesson when Clara was still coming as a visitor rather than a resident, was that a nearly identical plant grew alongside the edible one. The two plants were distinguishable by a faint purple tinge at the base of the stem, a coloration barely visible in good light and invisible in the low amber light of the cave. She ate the wrong plant on a Tuesday evening in November. By Wednesday morning, she understood she had made a serious mistake. She spent 3 days on the floor of the main chamber, in a state she would later describe in her notebook with characteristic plainness as very bad and then worse and then very bad again. Her body worked systematically to reject everything she had consumed. She could not keep water down. She could not stand without the walls performing a slow rotation around her. She lay on the warm stone floor and listened to her own heartbeat with the focused attention of someone taking inventory of a resource that might be running low, and she thought, with the particular clarity that the edges of serious illness produce, about the full sequence of choices that had brought her to this exact position on this exact floor. On the 4th day, she was able to sit up without the walls moving. On the 5th day, she kept water down. On the 6th day, she made herself walk to the hot spring and sit in the mineral-rich steam, which helped in the way that hot springs help with nearly everything if you are patient enough to let them. Then she went back to her notes, found the page about the edible plant, found the description that did not mention the purple stem base, and spent an hour at the spring comparing the two plants under every light condition she could create or find until she could distinguish them instantly, in the dark, by touch if necessary. She wrote 3 pages in her notebook about what she had learned, not just about the plants, about the nature of confident ignorance, which was different from ignorance and harder to recover from, about the difference between watching someone else do something and understanding why they do it that way, about the distance between knowing a thing and having survived it. She ended those 3 pages with a sentence she would read many times in the years that followed. The plant does not care what I thought I knew. It only cares what I actually know. These are not the same thing, and I must stop confusing them. The second near-death came in February, a cold snap that dropped the surface temperature to 45 below and managed, through some confluence of wind direction and geological chance, to pull the cave temperature down to 42 degrees. 42 degrees was survivable, but required a different relationship with everything, a relationship that left no margin for error and no reserve for anything that was not essential survival. Her fire burned continuously for 11 days. She rationed wood so precisely that she allowed herself exactly 4 logs every 8 hours, counted not by a clock, which she did not have, but by the rhythm of the geothermal vent, which pulsed slightly in its heat output in a pattern she had been learning for months, the way you learn the breathing of someone sleeping in the same room, without trying, through simple proximity and attention. On the 9th day of the cold snap, with her wood supply at the exact boundary of what she calculated would last through the freeze, and no further, she allowed herself 1 hour of what she called in her notebook honest accounting. She listed every resource she had. She listed every resource she lacked. She listed every skill she needed and did not yet possess, and every skill she possessed that she had not yet fully developed or applied. She was 19 years old, and the list of what she lacked was long. But she noticed as she wrote that every item on the deficiency list was finite and specific. Everything on it had a name. Everything named could be addressed. She drew a line at the bottom of the list. Below the line, she wrote one sentence. Mabel did this for 40 years alone. I can do it. She closed the notebook and fed one of her ration logs into the fire and did not open the accounting page again for 5 years. Mabel Runningwater was not an easy teacher in any season, but she was hardest in the first year after Clara moved into the Badlands permanently. The old woman had known, Clara believed, long before the Whitfields left, that something like this was coming. Mabel paid attention to the way things moved, the way animals moved, and weather moved, and people moved, and she had watched the Whitfield situation through several seasons from her ridges and formed her own conclusions about its trajectory. When Clara appeared at the cave entrance in early May of 1883, with her gray mare and her carefully packed saddlebags, and her eyes holding that particular expression of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they had been carrying for a long time and are now ready to act on it, Mabel looked at her for a full minute without speaking. Then she said, "Come, Nan, I'll put water on." That was the extent of the welcome. After the water, there was work. Mabel taught in the way that the land itself teaches, by presenting the situation and then stepping back to let the student encounter it directly. She would show Clara a thing once, with complete attention and precision, and then expect Clara to do it. And when Clara did it wrong, which was often and sometimes spectacularly, Mabel would look at the result and say, with the absolute flatness of someone who has no investment in softening a truth, "Try again." She did not explain what had gone wrong unless the student could not determine it from examination. She believed, and had mentioned once in a moment of unusual expansiveness, that the lesson learned from failure properly examined was worth 3 times the lesson learned from instruction. Clara had written this down immediately and found it to be accurate. There was one afternoon in the second summer when Clara got something badly wrong in a way that cost her a month of work. She had been redirecting a hot spring flow to irrigate a small garden she was establishing in a side chamber, using a channel she had cut in the rock over several weeks of daily effort. The channel worked in the sense that water moved through it, but she had cut it at the wrong angle, 2 degrees steeper than it should have been, and the water, instead of spreading across the garden bed, pooled at one end and flooded the soil she had prepared and planted over the course of a month. She sat on the wet floor of the side chamber and looked at her ruined garden and felt something press against the back of her eyes that she recognized as the accumulated weight of being 19 years old and alone and wrong again. Mabel came and stood beside her. The old woman looked at the flooded bed for a while with the calm of someone who has watched many things fail and understands failure as information rather than verdict. "The earth does not care about your plan," Mabel said in the tone she used for things that were important enough to be stated plainly. "The earth has its own plan. Your job is not to make the earth follow yours. Your job is to understand its plan well enough to find your place inside it." She paused. Then, with the closest thing to gentleness she usually managed, which was a slight softening of her usual flatness, The angle was 2 degrees too steep. Cut again. Flatter this time. Clara cut again. The second channel worked. The garden produced its first turnips in the fall of that year, small and misshapen but real, grown in a cave in a place everyone agreed was worthless. And Clara ate them with the particular satisfaction of something earned twice. By the end of the second year, the garden was producing potatoes, turnips, and a hardy variety of mushroom that grew naturally near the hot spring and that Mabel had taught her to cultivate rather than simply harvest. By the end of the third year, she had expanded it to 3 beds in 2 different chambers, each fed by a carefully managed water channel, each producing through the winter months when nothing grew on the surface. She had also established a small herd of goats, 4 animals she had traded for with a crow family she encountered at the Badlands' eastern edge. People who knew Mabel and who, through that connection, extended to Clara a cautious and limited trust that grew slowly over subsequent seasons into something warmer. The goats required a daily attentiveness that she found, after long months of solitude, that had their own value but their own difficulty, that she needed. They were alive in a way that gardens were not, responsive and specific and occasionally contrary, and caring for them gave her days a rhythm and a purpose that ran alongside the larger purposes of survival and learning and the slow accumulation of knowledge. She named them. She wrote about them in her notebook with the directness she applied to everything, but also with something that was not quite sentiment and not quite love, but existed close enough to both that the distinction did not matter. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fire burned low, and the geothermal vent breathed its steady warmth up through the stone floor, Clara would climb to a particular ridge above the cave system. It was a high point with a clear sight line west toward Dodds Hollow, and on still evenings, she could see the smoke from the town's chimneys rising straight up into the cold sky, thin vertical lines against the dark, a kind of distant semaphore that told her the town was alive and warm and going about its business in complete ignorance of the fact that she was doing the same. She had started climbing to that ridge in her first autumn, telling herself it was to monitor weather patterns, which was partly true. The Badlands Ridge system was an excellent place to read incoming weather from the north, and Mabel had taught her to use elevation for that purpose. She kept telling herself that for about 3 weeks before she stopped pretending and simply admitted that she went there to watch a town that had decided she was dead. She watched it without anger, mostly. The anger had been present in the first weeks, a hot and useless thing, and she had examined it the same way she examined everything, with the honest accounting method, and found that it consumed resources she needed for other things and produced nothing she could use. She had set it aside not because it was wrong, but because it was expensive. What replaced it over the years was something cooler and more durable, something that watched and recorded and waited. She watched the cattle drives in the late summers, the dust rising off the trails as the herds moved through the flats south of town. She watched the railroad arrive in 1885, the surveyors first with their equipment and deliberate movements, then the crews, then the glint of iron rails extending toward Dodds Hollow from the east, connecting it to the larger world it had always been pretending it was part of. She watched the town change with the railroad's arrival, new buildings going up, wagon traffic increasing, the general quickening of a place that has been given a reason to believe in its own future. She watched Sheriff Harlan Dodd. She could not see him clearly from the ridge at that distance, but she knew which figure was his from the way he moved through town. The particular weight of a man who wears authority like a coat he has owned for so long it has shaped itself to him. She watched him receive visits from men who arrived on the railroad from the east and left on it again within 2 days, men in good coats who moved through Dodds Hollow with the specific purposefulness of people on business that the town was not intended to fully understand. She watched these visits correlate over the years that followed with events in the territory. A small rancher on the western edge losing his grazing rights after a boundary dispute no one could quite explain. 2 families on the northern range selling their land at below market prices after a season of unexpected difficulties. The gradual absorption of small holdings into larger ones, a quiet rearrangement of who owned what that was individually explicable and collectively systematic. She started a second section in her notebook. She dated each entry. She recorded what she saw from the ridge, the arrivals and departures, the subsequent events she could observe, the pattern that emerged from placing them side by side in the same record. She did not know exactly what she was building in those years of watching and recording. She knew only that what she was seeing was wrong, and that wrong things properly documented became something different from wrong. They became provable. And provable wrong things in the right hands at the right moment became something different still. She was still learning what that something was. Mabel Runningwater died on a Tuesday in late November of 1886. She had been slowing for a year before that, which Clara had watched and noted and refused to speak of because Mabel had not spoken of it, and because raising what Mabel had not chosen to raise felt like a presumption, a violation of the old woman's right to manage her own ending in her own way. Mabel moved more carefully on cold mornings. She sat longer at the fire in the evenings with a quality of stillness that was different from her usual stillness, deeper, more interior, the stillness of someone listening to something only they could hear. But she kept teaching until the last few weeks, kept the flat, demanding quality of her attention fully operational, kept correcting and expecting and showing until she did not have the physical capacity to do those things anymore. In the last weeks, she talked more than she had in 3.5 years. Not about herself, about the land, about what the cave system had meant to her and given her over 40 years of living inside it. About what she understood regarding the relationship between people and the ground under their feet that the surveyors and the railroad men and the deed transfer agents with their maps and their envelopes would never understand. Not because they were stupid, but because they were looking at the land with the wrong question. They were asking what it was worth. The right question was what it knew. And then, 4 days before she died, she told Clara the thing that changed the shape of everything Clara thought she understood about her own situation. They were sitting by the fire in Mabel's smaller chamber, off the main cave, the fire between them, the vent warm under the floor, the world above freezing, and neither of them inside it. The old woman was quiet for a long time in the way she was quiet when she was deciding something. Not absent, but present in a different register, interior. Then she said, "Your father came to see me." Clara was very still. "When?" "Before you did, by 2 years, the summer before you first found this place. He came out into the Badlands asking questions about the land." Clara waited. Mabel's pauses were never empty. "He asked me if the Badlands had value," Mabel said. "I told him no. I told him it was bad rock and dead ground and that nothing of use to anyone had ever come from it. I thought if I told him that he would stop looking and leave the land alone." She looked at her hands the way she did when she was assessing the distance between intention and outcome. "I was wrong. The railroad people did not take my word. They sent their own men. Men who read rock and ground and what lies under both. And what those men found was what you and I know is here. The heat, the vents, the water, the chambers." Clara said, "They know about the cave system. They know there is something here of geological significance. They do not know its full extent, not yet. Their surveys were partial, but they know enough to want it." Mabel looked at her. "Your father sold them the right to find out everything else. He sold them the rights to this land, all of it, before he left Montana. That is why he left. Not because the ranch failed, though the ranch failing made a convenient explanation. The railroad money was the reason. The ranch failure was only the excuse he needed." Clara sat with this. The fire made its small sounds. The vent breathed its warmth. "That's why Dodd declared me dead," she said. Not a question. The architecture of it had become suddenly visible, the way a landscape becomes visible when the light shifts and what had been shadow becomes ground. "A living girl who was present when her father made that deal is a complication," Mabel said. "A girl who asked questions and was not easily managed. A girl who knew those hills. A girl who might, if she survived long enough, make claims on the land or cause difficulties for the people who intended to use it." She paused. A dead girl is a closed file. Clara looked at her notebook lying closed on the stone beside her. 2 years of observations, dates and figures and patterns recorded because they were wrong without yet knowing precisely how they were wrong or what the wrong was in service of. She understood now. "There is more," Mabel said. "The railroad company has been paying Dodd for 3 years to maintain the Badlands as territory no one examines too closely, to discourage settlement in this area, to handle difficulties that arise. The men you have been watching him meet from the trains, those are railroad men, That is your sheriff's second income. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you know this?" "The Crow families on the eastern edge know things," Mabel said. "They have been watching this territory longer than the railroad has existed. They told me what they saw. I have been waiting to tell you until you had enough of your own records to understand what it meant." She looked at Clara with the full weight of 70 years of paying attention. "Now do you have enough?" Mabel died 4 days later on a Tuesday morning, quietly, in the cave she had lived in for 40 years. Clara was beside her. The geothermal vent breathed its warmth through the stone floor as it always had, steady and ancient, the sleeping fire far below, doing what it had always done, entirely unconcerned with the small human passage occurring above it. Clara buried her in the old way, the way Mabel had taught her through instruction and through the stories she told about how things were done and why they were done that way. She prepared the grave on the ridge overlooking the cave system, east-facing, with the view of the Badlands spreading south and west. She said what words she could remember of the ones Mabel had taught her, said them as accurately as her memory would allow, because accuracy was what respect looked like in a context where sentiment would be presumptuous. She sat by the grave for a long time in the cold afternoon light. The wind moved over the ridge with the sound of something traveling a very long distance. She thought about 40 years of living in a place that everyone had agreed was worthless. She thought about the particular courage it required to refuse the story other people had decided was your life, and to find a different one in a landscape they had written off. Then she went back down into the cave, opened her notebook to the observation section, and wrote down everything Mabel had told her. She wrote the dates, the names, the sequence as she now understood it. She wrote the connection between her father's land sale and Dodd's death certificate, and the railroad company's payments and the surveys, and the pattern of small ranchers losing their land. She wrote it all in one continuous entry, the way it connected, because that was how truth worked, not as isolated facts, but as a structure, and the structure was now fully visible to her. When she finished, she read it back. Then she added one line at the bottom. "This is enough, but timing matters. Wait for the moment when the whole truth can arrive somewhere it will stick." She closed the notebook and sat in the warm cave while the world above froze and thought about what she had and what she would do with it, and when. In the spring of 1884, Clara had made a discovery that proved more consequential than anything except Mabel's teaching itself. She had been exploring the eastern passage of the cave system, a section she had mapped in outline but not explored fully, working her way through a low connection between the second and third chambers with a candle and her notebook, measuring distances by her own stride length and recording the direction changes by compass. The passage narrowed to a crawl space and then unexpectedly opened into a fourth chamber she had not known existed. It was smaller than the main chamber, perhaps 20 feet across, and the ceiling was low enough that she had to stoop in the center. But the floor was dry and level, and there was a shelf of natural rock along one wall that would hold a great deal. More importantly, there was a secondary vent in the floor, smaller than the main vent but consistent, and the air in this chamber was warmer than any other part of the cave system she had mapped. On the coldest days, when the main chamber dropped toward 50 degrees, this smaller room held 60. She sat in it for a long time, understanding what she had found. She began using it as a document room. She moved her notebooks there first, wrapped in oilcloth bundles sealed with the rendered goat fat, then the maps. Then the correspondence she had begun, slow and careful, with two people whose existence she had become aware of through the Crow families at the Badlands edge, people who dealt in territorial land law, and who did not know who she was, but who had begun, through indirect inquiry, to provide her with information about homestead rights and deed transfer requirements in the specific legal standards for contesting a land sale made without full disclosure of the land's character. She was building a case. She had not used that word for it until the third year, but that was what it was, built the same way she built everything, carefully, one piece at a time, checked for accuracy and tested for weakness. In the summer of 1887, a man named Edward Graves came to Dodd's Hollow. Clara had been watching the town from her ridge for nearly 4 years by then, and she had developed the ability to read, from a distance, the difference between the ordinary traffic of a small railroad town and the arrival of something that mattered. Graves arrived on the Tuesday train from Helena and did not leave on Wednesday, which the railroad men always did, or Thursday, which was when the supply merchants left. He was still there on Friday and on Saturday and into the following week. He moved differently from the railroad company men she had observed over the years, where they moved with the specific purposefulness of people delivering or collecting something. Graves moved with the slower, more lateral attention of someone gathering, stopping in different parts of town at different hours, sitting rather than standing, watching rather than conducting. She could see from the ridge that he carried something white, catching light when he moved through the open street. Notebooks. She thought about this for 2 days. Then she came down from the Badlands for the first time in 4 years. She did it with the care she applied to any significant action, choosing a moonless night, coming into the eastern edge of Dodds Hollow, through the back lots where there were no windows facing that direction, moving with the quiet that 4 years of moving through Badlands terrain in all weathers had built into her. She spent 2 nights observing Graves before approaching him, learning his patterns and his rhythms and, as best she could determine from a distance, his character. On the 3rd evening, she stepped into the lamplight beside his window at the boarding house and said, "You're a reporter." He looked up without the alarm that most men would have shown at a figure appearing without warning from the darkness outside a lit window. The absence of alarm told her something. "Journalist," he said. "Edward Graves, Helena Courier. The distinction matters to those of us who practice it." He looked at her with a particular quality of attention she recognized as professional, comprehensive, and calibrated. "And you are. Someone with 5 years of documented evidence about the Montana Central Railroad's land acquisition practices in this territory," she said, "and about the financial arrangement between the railroad and the man wearing the silver star in this town." Graves closed his notebook. "Sit down," he said. She sat. They talked for 2 hours. She told him the pattern of what she had observed, the arrivals and departures, the correlations with land transfers, the systematic nature of what had been done to small ranchers in the territory. She did not tell him about the death certificate. She did not tell him about the cave system. She did not tell him who she was, and she was careful about what she revealed and in what order. The way you are careful when you have something valuable and are not yet certain of the terms. He listened with the focused energy of a man who knows a significant story when it arrives in front of him, asking sharp questions that revealed both what he already knew and what he still needed. Then he asked what she wanted out of it. She asked what he intended to write. "Railroad corruption," he said, leaning forward with the energy of someone who has been working a large story for a long time and can see the shape of its completion. "Land acquisition fraud at scale. It connects to work I've been doing across 3 territories. Your sheriff is one piece of a structure that goes a long way east of here. And the people he displaced," Clara Barnes said, "the families pushed off their land, the small ranchers." He hesitated. Small, barely a pause, but she had learned to read small things. "Local stories," Vonnie said, "important locally. But the national story is the structure, the company, the scale. That's what changes things at the level where change matters." She looked at him for a moment, reading what was there. He was not wrong about the story's scale. He was not dishonest about his intentions. He was a man doing his job with genuine conviction, and his job was calibrated to a size of story that was real and significant. But she could see exactly what would happen if she gave him what she had now. He would publish a piece about railroad corruption in Montana Territory. Dodd would be a name in a list. The company would absorb the exposure, adjust its methods, continue. The full truth, which included a woman declared dead by the man they were discussing, and the land she had been living on for 5 years, and the legal case she had been building, and the systematic pattern of fraud at its center, would remain partial. And partial truth, as Mabel had understood it, was what allowed the structure to survive by giving it room to adapt. "I need more time," she said. "How much?" "I don't know precisely. When the time is right, you will hear from me. What I give you then will be worth considerably more than what I could give you now." She walked back into the darkness, and Graves sat at his window with his notebook in the particular frustration of a journalist who has just been told to wait by the most compelling source he has encountered in 2 years of working a major story. Clara walked back through the dark to the Badlands. She climbed to her ridge and looked at the sleeping town below, and thought about Mabel's understanding of the Earth's plan and finding your place inside it, and the patience that required. The right moment was not yet, but it was closer than it had ever been. She was on the ridge on the morning of January 11th, 1888, when she saw the sky change. The change came from the north. The ordinary gray of a Montana winter sky, which she had learned to read the way Mabel had taught her, each variation and shade carrying information about what was coming and when, darkened to something different. A blue-gray that had weight to it, that pressed toward the earth rather than sitting passively above it. A color that communicated intent. She had seen this color once before, in her second winter, a storm that had lasted 3 days and left 6 cattle dead on the western ranch. But that sky had been this color in a smaller register. The sky she was looking at now was this color at a scale that had no comparison in her 4 years of observing it from this ridge. Mabel had described this kind of sky to her once, in the context of the old stories about winters that had changed the landscape permanently. Winters severe enough that the Crow had specific words for them because the ordinary word for winter was insufficient. Clara had written it in her notebook. When the sky goes iron in the north and the air goes still as a held breath, that is not weather. That is a reckoning. She stood on the ridge for a long time, watching, calculating. She had food for 6 weeks. She had firewood for 2 months. She had a cave that would stay 55 degrees while everything above it froze into something unrecognizable. Below her, the town that bore the name of the man who had signed her death certificate had whatever wood its citizens had thought to lay in for an ordinary winter. She thought about Mabel's words, not the famous formulation that everyone would remember, but the quieter thing the old woman had said one evening near the end, sitting at the fire, watching the steam move in the cave air. The land keeps nothing for itself, Mabel had said. Everything it has, it gives, to the roots and the water and the fire and the people who know how to ask. That is what it is to belong to a place, not to own it, to know how to ask it what it has. Clara thought about the children she had watched grow on that ridge, the old people she had watched slow, the families who had no part in what Dodd had done and no knowledge of what the railroad intended. She thought about Harlan Dodd, burning whatever he was burning in his jail, while the town that bore his family's name froze around him. She thought about Roy Elkins, who had signed his name on her death certificate with a shaking hand and had been carrying that weight ever since. She thought about her notebook, in the cave below her, with its 5 years of documentation. She thought about Edward Graves waiting in Helena for word that the time was right. 3 days, maybe 4. She climbed down from the ridge and went into the cave. She did her inventory the way she always did, the clear accounting of what was real, what would be needed, and whether the two could be made to meet. Then she went to the document room, the warm inner chamber she had found in her second year, and she unwrapped the main notebook from its oilcloth casing and sat with it in the warmth of the secondary vent. She opened to the last entry, January 10th, 1888. She read the final line she had written the day before. Then she opened to a fresh page and wrote the date, January 11th. She looked at the page for a moment, the clean white space of it, the beginning of what came next. She wrote, "The sky went iron in the north this morning. The air is still. It is time." She wrapped the notebook carefully, placed it in the saddlebag she kept packed and ready, and went to check on her mules. She had 3 days to prepare. She had been preparing for 5 years. She left the cave before dawn on January 14th. The temperature on the surface was 51 below zero. She knew this not from a thermometer, which had cracked in her third winter and never been replaced, but from the way the air behaved at different temperatures, a calibration she had learned from Mabel and refined over 5 winters of daily exposure. At 40 below, exhaled breath froze before it dispersed into the air around it. At 50 below, it fell. At 51 below, it fell fast, like small snow from your own mouth. And the sound the cold made against exposed skin was less a sensation than a note, a single sustained pitch the body registered before the mind could name it. She had spent 3 days preparing. The 3 pack mules were loaded with split firewood, stacked and tied with the efficiency of someone who has been splitting and stacking wood alone for 5 years and has reduced every step of it to its necessary form. No movement wasted. She had packed dried meat, smoked over the geothermal vent through the fall, enough to sustain 40 people for a week if rationed properly. 12 blankets, accumulated over years through trade with the Crow families on the Badlands' eastern edge. Dried vegetables from her cave garden, 2 sealed clay pots of rendered goat fat, which could be burned for supplemental heat in an emergency. In her saddlebag, she carried the notebook. She rode west through the pre-dawn dark with the mules behind her on a lead rope, moving along the route she had memorized through every season over 5 years until it was as known to her as the cave floor. The gray mare moved without hesitation. The animal had made versions of this journey many times in the years of watchful observation and had developed a calm familiarity with the terrain that was, Clara thought, its own form of knowledge. She did not look at the sky. She watched the ground and the trail and the rock formations that told her where she was with more precision than any compass. She moved through the pre-dawn dark with the particular concentration of someone doing something she has thought about for a long time and is now simply doing. At the edge of the Badlands, where the broken country gave way to the flat approach to town, she stopped. She had stood at this boundary many times over 5 years, always to turn back. She thought for a moment about what she was carrying toward those distant lines of thin smoke. Not just firewood and food and blankets. The notebook. 5 years of documentation. The legal claims she had prepared. The letter to Graves that was folded and sealed inside the front cover, ready to be sent when the time came. She thought about Mabel, buried on the ridge behind her in the grave that faced east. She thought about what the old woman had said, not the formulations that had become Clara's private philosophy, but the simpler things she had said one afternoon in the first year, standing at the cave entrance watching Clara pack up to go back to the failing ranch. "You will know when to come back for good," Mabel had said. "The land will tell you, not in words, in the way things become clear when the light is right." The light was right now, in the sense that things had become clear. She rode through the boundary and headed west. Main Street was empty when she reached it. Nobody was outside who did not have to be. The buildings had the sealed, defended look of structures under sustained assault. Every gap stuffed, every window dark. The only signs of life were the thin columns of smoke from a few chimneys, desperate looking against the pewter sky. She rode slowly down the center of the street, the mules behind her, the firewood visible on their backs. She did not hurry. Arriving was different from appearing, Mabel had said, and the difference was pace. The jail door opened before she reached it. Roy Elkins came out first, moving with the stiffness of a man who has been cold for 4 days. He was 40 years old, but he looked older, with the particular exhaustion of a man who carries a guilt he has never been able to set down, because setting it down would require admitting what it weighed. He stopped on the porch and stared at her with the expression of someone looking at something that does not belong in the category of things that exist. Harlan Dodd came out behind him. Dodd was 57 and looked it, but his age was different from Elkins. It was the age of a man who has spent 11 years being larger than he actually was, sustained by the daily reality of authority and the silver star and the unexamined assumption that these things were the same as legitimacy. He had been sitting in a freezing jail for 4 days, burning his own office, and he had, for perhaps the first time in those 11 years, encountered a problem that his authority could not solve, and the encounter had done something to the way he held himself. He looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't fit the world you have organized around a particular set of facts. Clara let him look. She sat on the gray mare in the center of Main Street and let the moment exist at its own pace, the way Mabel had taught her that important moments needed to exist, not rush toward their resolution, but allowed to arrive at it. She was 34 years old. She had come to this place with 3 days of food and a gray mare and more knowledge than she had known she possessed, and she had built a life in the place everyone had dismissed. And she had watched this town and this man for 5 years from a ridge she could see from here, and she had a notebook in her saddlebag that contained everything the next chapter of this story required. She did not look like what Harlan Dodd had signed a death certificate for. She let the silence run for another moment. Behind the jail, a shutter opened and a face appeared and was gone. From the direction of the church, a figure in a heavy coat was making its deliberate way along the iced boardwalk toward Main Street, moving with the purposeful tread of someone who has heard something unusual and has decided to go see what it is. "Sheriff Dodd," Claire said, her voice carried easily, "I hear you're running low on firewood." He stared at her. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" My name is Whitfield, she said, Clara May Whitfield. You signed my death certificate 5 years ago. She watched his face move through what she had imagined it would move through, standing on the ridge over 5 winters, the confusion resolving into recognition, resolving into the particular pallor of a man who has received a bill he knew was coming and had spent years finding ways to not look at the amount. As you can see, Clara said, the reports of my death were somewhat exaggerated. It was Reverend Agnes Holt who reached Main Street first. Agnes was 55 years old, solidly built, with gray hair pinned back with the kind of practicality that expressed itself in every aspect of her character. She had been the town's minister for 9 years, long enough to have learned that her congregation needed her to be useful more than they needed her to be spiritual, and she had adjusted her practice accordingly. She had given the Methodist pews to the freezing families 2 nights ago without a moment of internal debate. God would understand. She had always found God more practically minded than most of his official representatives allowed. She came around the corner of the hardware store and stopped. She looked at the woman on the gray horse with the pack mules and the firewood. She looked at the copper red hair braided against the coat. She looked at the face. Agnes Holt had officiated at the Whitfield family's arrival in Dodds Hollow in 1880, had welcomed them into the congregation, had watched them struggle and decline over 3 years with the particular helplessness of someone who can see the ending but has no legitimate authority to change it. She had seen Clara at Sunday services during those years, the difficult daughter who sat at the back and looked at the windows during the sermon and asked questions afterward that were more interesting than anything Agnes had said from the pulpit. She had thought about that girl sometimes in the years after Dodd's announcement at the council meeting, had wondered with the private honesty she allowed herself in the hours before sleep whether the announcement had been as certain as its delivery suggested. Clara Whitfield, Agnes said. Not a question, a confirmation of something she had, in some unexamined part of herself, been waiting to confirm. He was wrong, Clara said. She looked at the Reverend with something that was not quite warmth but lived close to it. I have firewood and food and a warm place for everyone in this town who can make a 2-hour journey. I need your help getting people moving. Agnes looked at the firewood. She looked at Dodd standing on his jail porch with the expression of a man watching his own history perform a revision of itself. She looked back at Clara. Then she turned and walked back toward the church at the fastest pace the ice permitted, calling names as she went. In the 20 minutes that followed, before the town's organizing energy fully took hold, Dodd came down off the porch and stood in the street 10 feet from Clara's horse. He had his coat pulled tight and his hands in his pockets and his silver star catching the thin morning light. You've been out there the whole time, he said. Yes. In the Badlands, the whole 5 years. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, something that was not quite the managed authority she had heard him project from the ridge, but something rawer and more honest. The voice of a man who has been very cold for 4 days and has been thinking, in the way that serious cold forces a man to think, about what is actually real. How, he said. Geothermal vents, 3 connected cave chambers. Temperature holds at 55 degrees through any surface winter. She looked at him steadily. The railroad company has known the geothermal features are there for years. It's why they wanted the land. It's why they paid you to keep the area clear of settlers. It's why you needed me to be dead. The town was beginning to stir around them. Doors opening, voices, the sound of people moving with the urgent energy of people who have been told that survival is possible and are choosing to believe it. Dodd said, how long have you known? That you knew I was alive when you signed the certificate? I found where Elkins covered my tracks, 4 days after you left the Badlands. I understood what it meant. She paused. I didn't know about the railroad's connection to the death certificate until 1886. Mabel Runningwater told me before she died. He had no response to that. What was there to say? The woman he had declared dead was alive. She had been alive the entire time. She had watched him from a ridge for 5 years. She had known, for 2 of those years, the full shape of what he had done and why. I have been watching you from that ridge, Clara said, in the same steady, clear tone. I have a notebook, dates, meetings, names, the full pattern of who visits you from which trains and what happens to the land holdings of small ranchers in the weeks that follow. I have enough to end your career and implicate 3 senior Montana Central Railroad officials. I have had enough for 2 years. Then why? He started. Because partial truth makes partial change, she said. I learned that from someone wiser than either of us. The right time is when the whole truth arrives somewhere it will stick and change what needs changing. Behind her, the town was waking fully. Roy Elkins found her by the mules while she was untying blankets for the journey. He came with the careful movement of a man who has rehearsed an approach for a long time and is discovering that rehearsal does not adequately prepare you for the actual moment. He was 40 years old, and the weight he had been carrying since July of 1883 had not diminished with time. It had calcified the way guilt calcifies when you don't address it, becoming structural, something you build your behavior around without admitting it's the thing you're building around. Miss Whitfield, he said. She looked up from the blanket knot. She gave him her full attention, the quality of presence that Mabel had modeled and that she had worked to develop, the attention that said she was listening and would not interrupt and would hear the whole of it. I covered those tracks, he said. July 1883. I found them and I covered them because Dodd told me to, and because I was afraid of what not doing what he told me would cost. He stopped. The essential fact was in those sentences. Adding more would only be explaining it, and it did not need explanation. It needed acknowledgement, which was different and harder. Clara was quiet for a moment. Around them the town moved, voices and footsteps and the sound of horses being brought out of the few still operating stables. I know, she said. I've been carrying that for 5 years. I know that too. He waited. She finished untying the blanket knot, handed the blanket to a woman who had appeared beside her with a child on her hip and exhausted relief competing for control of her face. Then Clara reached into her saddlebag and took out the notebook. She opened it to a page near the back, dense with small writing, and held it out to him. He took it. He read. His name appeared twice on the page. The date, July 1883. The facts as she had reconstructed them from the evidence of the covered tracks and the subsequent behavior of both Dodd and the railroad's Montana operations. The instruction Dodd had given, Elkins' compliance, and then, in the same careful hand, a second paragraph that noted the context, the position Elkins had been in, the pressure applied, the difference between initiating a wrong and complying with one under duress. I wrote what you did, she said. I also wrote why, as best I could determine. There is a difference between your action and his. The notebook reflects that difference. His hands were not entirely steady. What are you going to do with this? He said. I'm going to save the town first, she said. Then I'm going to do what needs doing. She took the notebook back, closed it, returned it to the saddlebag. For what it's worth, Roy, what you did was wrong. But you were also the only person in this territory who stood close enough to the truth to be afraid of it. That is not nothing. Fear of a wrong thing is not nothing. It means you knew it was wrong. That distinction matters, even when it didn't change the outcome. She turned back to the mules. Elkins stood for a moment holding the fact of this, the weight of being seen clearly and not simply condemned for what the clear sight revealed. Then he went to help with the horses. 47 people made the journey into the Badlands that morning. Clara led them on the gray mare, pace set to what the slowest could manage. A wagon at the back carried 6 people, including 2 elderly women and a boy of 4 who had not been warm in a week and who fell asleep against his grandmother's arm within 5 minutes of starting to move. They rode in the silence of people who are too cold and too exhausted and too desperate for ordinary conversation, who have placed everything on the judgment of a woman most of them had never met. Following her into country, most of them had never entered. Dodd rode at the back of the column. He had not been invited and had not been excluded. He had appeared on his horse as the group organized itself and had taken his place at the rear with the quiet of a man who understands that he has forfeited the front of things for the foreseeable future. The 2-hour journey took 3 hours because of the cold and the terrain and the wagon's pace. By the time the first riders reached the cave entrance, the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees, and 2 children were crying with the shallow, exhausted crying of children whose bodies have been managing the cold for too long and have stopped being able to manage it quietly. Clara dismounted and had the entrance cleared, and the first people through it within minutes. She moved through the group with the calm authority of someone in their own home, directing people toward the warmest zones near the central vent, The side chamber where the hot spring provided water that steamed in the cave air. The prepared areas where she had laid out her stored food for distribution. The effect of the cave on people who had been freezing for 4 days was not gradual. It was immediate and total. The moment the warmth of the geothermal vent reached them, past the entrance passage and into the main chamber, people stopped moving in the braced and defended way of the very cold and simply stood as if they had forgotten how to stand in a place that was not trying to kill them. A woman let out a sound that was not quite a word. The boy of 4, awake now, looked around the warm, firelit chamber with the expression of a child who has been told that something impossible is true and is discovering that the truth of it is better than even the impossible description suggested. Within an hour, children were removing their outer coats. Agnes Holt worked through the chamber with the same purposefulness she applied to everything, checking on the elderly, organizing the food distribution, speaking to frightened children with a directness they responded to better than comfort would have. She found Clara at the hot spring filling clay pots and said, without preamble, "You built all of this alone." "I had a teacher," Clara said, "the best teacher I have known." "Stone smoke," Agnes said. "The woman they called a ghost." "Her name was Mabel Runningwater," Clara said. "She refused to live inside someone else's definition of where she belonged. She chose this place instead and understood it the way it deserved to be understood. Everything I know about why this land is worth living in, I learned from her." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What you're going to do with what you know about Dodd, about the railroad." She said it carefully, in the way she approached most difficult truths, sideways before direct. "Whatever form that takes, I'll stand up for it, in whatever room, in front of whoever needs to hear it." Clara looked at her. "I know," she said. "That's why I came to you first on the street this morning, before I spoke to anyone else." The evening of the first day in the cave, after the immediate crises of cold and hunger and fear had been addressed, and the 47 people were settled into the warmth, Dodd came to find Clara. He came to the far end of the main chamber, away from the family groups, and sat down on the rock across from her fire without being invited. The sitting without being invited was the first honest thing she had seen him do, a small act without the management of impression that had characterized everything she had observed about him from the ridge. He was quiet for a moment. The fire made its small sounds. From somewhere deeper in the cave, a child laughed at something, the sudden bright note of a child who has been cold for days and is warm now, and cannot contain what that feels like. "I made a mistake," he said. She looked at him. "That's not right either," he said, correcting himself with the particular effort of a man who has decided, perhaps for the first time in his public life, that precision matters more than self-protection. "A mistake is something you do without understanding. I understood. I did a wrong thing, several wrong things, over several years, each one small enough to tell myself it didn't add up to anything serious. But they do add up." He paused. "They added up to you. To a 19-year-old girl alone in the Badlands because I decided the math was simpler if she was dead." Clara said nothing. She had learned from Mabel that silence was not absence. Sometimes it was the most complete form of presence available. "I'm going to resign," he said, "when we go back. I'll stand up at whatever kind of meeting they call, and I'll say what I did. All of it. And then I'll sit down and let people decide what that means." "And the railroad," Clara said. He looked at her. She reached into her saddlebag and took out the notebook. She set it on the stone between them, closed. 5 years of documentation, she said, the pattern of payments, the names of the officials involved, the dates and the amounts in the correlating land transfers. It also contains a legal argument regarding the validity of my father's deed transfer. Given that the land was occupied and substantially improved prior to his sale of it, and given that the sale was made without disclosure of the land's known geological character to the purchasing party's own surveyors. She paused. "I have been developing that argument for 2 years with the help of 2 land attorneys in Helena who do not know my full situation but who have provided guidance on the relevant statutes." Dodd looked at the notebook. He did not reach for it. "You've been building a case," he said. "I've been building a complete record," she said. "Edward Graves at the Helena Courier has been waiting for 2 years for me to tell him the time is right. When we come out of this blizzard, I'm going to send word. What he publishes will not be the story of one corrupt sheriff in one small town. It will be the story of a systematic pattern of fraud across this territory, documented in detail, supported by evidence that cannot be adjusted around. The fire was low. She fed it from her rationed wood. In the cave behind them, Agnes Holt was telling a story to a group of children, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who knows how to make people wait for what comes next. Your resignation will matter more as part of that story than apart from it, Clara said. A man who comes forward before he is exposed is a different thing from a man who is uncovered. That difference will matter to how this lands in the territory and in the court. Dodd was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not respond. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this? You could let it simply happen to me. That would be justice by most people's accounting." She looked at him with the gray-green eyes that had watched this town for 5 years from the ridge. "Mabel Runningwater told me that the earth shares its warmth with everyone who knows how to ask," she said. "Not everyone who deserves it, not everyone who earned it, everyone who asks." She didn't say that to be sentimental. She said it because that was what she had observed to be true about how the land actually worked. It didn't withhold based on merit. It gave based on need and knowledge. She looked at the fire. "I didn't come back to punish you, Harlan. I came back because people were dying and I could help. The difference between you and me is not that I'm good and you're not. The difference is that I learned something you didn't. I learned that the value of a thing is not determined by whether the people who walk past it can see it. The land knew what it was worth. Mabel knew. I know. What you and the railroad and my father got wrong was not your intentions. It was your question. You asked what it was worth to you. The right question was what it was." She picked up the notebook and returned it to the saddlebag. "You have until the thaw to decide who you want to be when you walk back into that town," she said. "That's more time than you gave me." She stood and went back to the work of keeping 47 people warm and fed and alive through the worst blizzard in Montana Territory's recorded history. The blizzard lasted 11 more days. 47 people lived underground in the warmth that the sleeping fire far below provided, in the cave that everyone had agreed was worthless, eating the food that Clara had grown and stored over 5 years of living in the place that everyone had written off. The children played in the warm chambers. The elderly women slept through entire days and woke without the blue tinge around their mouths that had been there when they arrived. The boy of 4, whose name was Henry, and who had decided within 12 hours of arrival that the cave was the best place he had ever been, spent his days attempting to befriend the goats. On February 2nd, they emerged. The world above had been unmade. Cattle dead by the thousands. The losses across Montana Territory that winter would later be counted in the hundreds of thousands of animals. Buildings collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. The landscape transformed, simplified, everything that had been particular reduced to a single white uniformity. But 47 people were alive. All of them. Because of a woman who had been declared dead in this territory 5 years ago, and who had spent that time learning the secrets of the land that everyone had decided held none. The town meeting was held 2 weeks later, when the roads were passable and the surviving citizens of Dodds Hollow had returned to their homes and begun the long work of accounting for what the winter had cost. Dodd stood up before them and unpinned his silver star and set it on the table in front of him with a deliberateness that everyone in the room understood was final. He said what he had done. He said it without the rhetorical management he had applied to 11 years of public speech, without the authority voice, without the particular flatness that he had used to make unjust things sound simply factual. He said he had declared a living woman dead for reasons of financial arrangement and personal convenience. He said he had accepted payments from a railroad company to maintain certain conditions in the territory. He said he had looked away when small ranchers were pressured off land that the railroad wanted access to. He said he had covered these actions and covered the covering of them for 11 years and that the full accounting was in the notebook of the woman standing in the back of the room and that the notebook was going to a journalist in Helena who had already been provided with the context to understand what it documented. Then he sat down. The room was silent in the way rooms are silent when a true thing has been said plainly in public for the first time after a long period of everyone knowing it and no one saying it. Then Clara spoke. She stood at the back of the room with her arms at her eyes and her notebook in her hand, and she spoke to all of them, not just to Dodd, about what she had learned in 5 years of living in the place they had all agreed held nothing. The Badlands are not empty, she said. They never were. They are one of the most geologically significant pieces of land in this territory. The geothermal system, the cave chambers, the hot springs, these are not curiosities. They are resources of real and lasting value. The Montana Central Railroad has known this for years. They have been working systematically to control this land, and the man who just put his star on that table was part of the mechanism they used to do it. She held up the notebook. This goes to the Helena Courier within the week. What is published will initiate a territorial investigation. Several railroad officials will face serious consequences. The Homestead Act, protections that apply to small ranchers in this territory, will be central to that investigation's findings. She looked around the room. As for the cave system and the land, I have filed a homestead claim under the Act. The deed transfer my father made was deficient in its legal requirements and was made without the disclosures the law requires. I intend to contest it in territorial court. Reverend Holt has agreed to testify. Deputy Elkins has agreed to testify. She paused and let the room be still for a moment. I am not asking any of you for anything. I built my life in those hills without recognition from anyone in this room, and I am prepared to continue building it without any. I did not come back to be vindicated. I came back because people were dying and I could help. She looked at the full sweep of faces, people she had watched for 5 years from a ridge they never knew anyone stood on. My family wrote me off. Your sheriff wrote me off. Your whole territory wrote me off. And I built something in the place you all agreed was nothing. So the next time you stand at the edge of a piece of ground and call it worthless, or stand in front of a person and decide they are finished, I want you to remember what it felt like in that cave. Remember the cold you came in with and the warmth you found there, and remember who brought you to it. She walked toward the door. At the frame she stopped and turned, the way Mabel had sometimes turned at the end of a lesson, when the last thing needed saying. The earth remembers fire, she said. Long ago, this land burned from below. The fire is still there, sleeping. If you know where to look, you can find its warmth. She looked at the room one last time. So should we. She walked out into the February light, into the recovered landscape, into the rest of her life. The territorial investigation that Edward Graves initiated with his 7-part series in the Helena Courier through the spring of 1888 moved with the slow, institutional weight of things that have been documented too thoroughly to be deflected. 3 Montana Central Railroad officials were removed from their positions. The land acquisition practices in 3 territories were scrutinized and in several cases reversed. The deed transfer on the Badlands land was challenged in territorial court and found deficient on 2 grounds: the absence of required geological disclosure and the presence of a prior occupant with a valid homestead claim under the relevant statutes. The homestead claim held. Clara Mae Whitfield owned the cave system legally, permanently, and irrevocably. The land her father had sold to the railroad company for the price of a fresh start and a clear conscience came back to his daughter through the machinery of the same laws the railroad had been manipulating. And the particular poetry of this was not lost on anyone who knew the full story. Harlan Dodd died in the winter of 1892 from pneumonia that the doctor diagnosed in the people of what they had started calling simply crossing, understood as something more than physical. The family name had quietly fallen from the town's official designation sometime in the years after the investigation by the informal consensus of people who had decided that the name belonged to a chapter they were finished with. Dodd died as a private citizen, no star, no office, and his headstone on the hill outside town noted his years of residence and his years of service and said nothing about the woman he had declared dead, or the cave that had preserved 47 lives, or the notebook that had ended his career and contributed to the dismantling of a railroad company's fraudulent land scheme. His headstone said nothing about these things because there was nothing adequate to say about them in the space a headstone provides. Roy Elkins lived until 1901 and became, in the years after the blizzard, a different kind of officer under the town's new sheriff, a woman named Patricia Dorrance, who had been one of the 47 in the cave and who ran the office with a directness and an ethical clarity that Dodd's Hollow, rechristened Crossing, found initially surprising and then indispensable. Elkins was her most reliable deputy. He had learned at 40 years old the particular reliability of someone who has fully experienced the cost of the alternative and has no remaining appetite for it. Agnes Holt testified in the territorial court proceedings in the spring of 1888 with the steady, unembellished precision of a woman who has been telling truth as a professional practice for 20 years and knows the difference between truth that helps and truth that performs. Her testimony on the land's occupation and improvement was significant to the homestead claim's success. She and Clara continued the friendship that had announced itself on Main Street in January, the particular friendship of two women who had recognized something essential in each other at first sight and had never needed to explain what it was. Agnes retired from the ministry in 1900 and came often to the cave in the years that followed, sitting at the hot spring on summer afternoons, talking about what the land was and what people were and the relationship between wisdom and knowledge, and why distinguishing between them was worth the effort. Edward Graves wrote 8 stories connected to the investigation over the course of 1888 and 1889. The series won recognition in the Eastern press and was cited in subsequent territorial land reform legislation as significant early documentation of systematic fraud in public land acquisition. He came to the cave once, in the summer of 1889, to finally see what he had been writing about. Clara showed him the cave system with the patience of someone who has explained something many times to people who are encountering it for the first time. Graves stood in the main chamber for a long time without writing anything, which she took as a good sign. He published one final piece about Clara herself, about the 5 years in the notebook and the way she had built a case at the same time she was building a life. It ran on the front page of the Helena Courier on January 14, 1889. The first anniversary of the day she had ridden into Dodd's Hollow with firewood and 3 mules. It was a good piece. She read it once and put it in the document room with the other notebooks and did not read it again. She lived in the cave for another 40 years. She taught everyone who came looking. Crow families who remembered Mabel Running Water came first, in the months after the blizzard, to see who had taken on the old woman's knowledge of the land. Clara received them with the same direct hospitality she had been shown on her first day. Water on, sit down, here's what this place is. She learned from them in return the way Mabel had always learned, the way you learn from people who have been attending to a landscape longer than you have, which requires setting aside what you think you already know and making room for what they know instead. Ranchers came to understand the geothermal system and whether it could be useful to land, they worked. Government surveyors came in the 1890s with better equipment than her earlier contacts had used and found that someone had already mapped the cave system more thoroughly than their instruments could manage in a week, in a series of notebooks stored in a waterproof oilcloth bundle in a warm inner chamber. The maps revised and updated over 15 years of continuous habitation. Journalists came, naturalists came. In the early years of the new century, people began coming who used the word conservation, a word that was finding its weight in a country that had spent decades treating its land as something to be used up and was beginning, in some quarters, to understand that used up was a condition that did not reverse. These people found in Clara an ally who had understood the principle before the word for it existed, who had lived inside the argument for 20 years, who could explain with precision what the sleeping fire below the land had given to the surface above it, and why protecting the surface was the same as protecting the fire. She kept writing. The notebooks accumulated in the document room, their oilcloth bundles stacked in a careful order on the natural rock shelf, each one labeled and dated in the same small hand she had developed at 19. The notebooks contained the cave records, the geological observations, the seasonal variations in vent, heat output, and spring temperature, and cave humidity, the records of the garden and the goats and the visitors. They contained the legal correspondence and the court documents and the letters to and from Graves and the land attorneys. They contained, in the later volumes, a record of what the Badlands were doing and becoming as the century turned and the territory that had dismissed them began to understand what it had dismissed. The garden produced through every winter. The goats were replaced by successive generations, each group given names, each noted in the notebooks with the same direct attention she had applied to everything she recorded. Not sentiment, but presence. The acknowledgement that they were specific and alive, and that specific alive things deserved to be recorded as themselves. Clara May Whitfield died on February 8, 1928, in the cave where she had built her life and spent 65 years, and taught dozens of people what she knew about the land that everyone had agreed was worthless. She was 84 years old. She died warm, which was not a small thing in Montana in February, and which she had arranged without difficulty because she had spent 65 years learning exactly how to remain warm in this particular place on this particular patch of earth. She died with her notebook open on the stone beside her, the last entry written in the same small, careful hand she had developed at 19, the hand of someone who believed that words were instruments of precision and should be used accordingly. The last entry read, February 7th, cold tonight on the surface, vent steady at usual output, hot spring temperature normal. The goats are well, 40 years since the blizzard. Mabel would say the earth remembers. She would be right. She was usually right. They buried her next to Mabel Running Water on the ridge overlooking the cave system. Two graves facing east in the old way, with the view of the Badlands spreading south and the faint suggestion of crossing visible to the west on clear days. Clara had specified this arrangement in the instructions she had left with Agnes Holt's successor at the church, a young minister who had never met her but who carried out her wishes with the respect that one gives to the clearly considered instructions of someone who has thought carefully about what they want to leave behind. The headstone said, she found warmth where others saw nothing. The cave system was designated a Montana State Park in 1931, 3 years after Clara died. The designation came partly through the advocacy of people she had taught and partly through the records she had kept, which provided the geological and historical documentation that state park designation requires. The plaques at the entrance tell the story of the geothermal system, of Mabel Running Water, who first mapped it and understood it and refused to leave it, of Clara May Whitfield, who preserved that knowledge and expanded it and used it to save 47 lives on one January morning, and then spent the next 40 years teaching anyone who came to learn. The plaques note, in the careful language of official history, that the cave system was the subject of a significant territorial court case in 1888 that established precedents for homestead rights and disclosure requirements in land sales. The plaques do not have room for the full story, which includes a death certificate and a railroad company, and a notebook, and a woman who decided at age 19 that if the world was going to write her off, she would at least make sure she was doing something worth writing about. People come from across the country to see the geothermal vents and the hot spring in the main chamber, where 47 people survived the worst blizzard in Montana history. They walk the passages Clara mapped. They read the plaques. They look at the photographs, the few that exist, of a woman with copper red hair gone gray and gray-green eyes that still hold, even in the faded silver of old photography, the quality of someone who has been paying full attention for a very long time and intends to continue. Some of them, the ones who really understand what they are reading, walk up to the ridge after and leave something at the two graves. Flowers mostly, sometimes a stone, sometimes a note, though the notes weather quickly, and what they say is between the person who wrote them and whoever they believe might read them. They leave these things not because they knew Clara or Mabel, but because they recognize the shape of the story. The shape of someone who was written off completely and refused to disappear. The shape of knowledge held patiently and used at the right moment. The shape of warmth found in a place where everyone else had looked and seen nothing, offered freely and without condition to the people who had decided it was nothing. In crossing, which has been called that long enough now that most people have forgotten it was ever called anything else, they still say it. When someone makes the mistake of deciding too quickly that a place or a person or a situation is beyond recovery, beyond value, beyond the effort of a closer look. Don't make the sheriff's mistake. It means more than one man's specific error in the winter of 1883. It means the whole category of errors that flow from deciding you already know the full value of something you have not taken adequate time to understand. It means the cost of choosing the convenient story over the true one. It means the particular and recurring blindness of people who can only read one kind of value and so declare worthless everything that carries its worth in a different form. Clara May Whitfield had been shown a different form of worth by a Crow woman who had refused to let other people's decisions determine the geography of her life, who had walked into a landscape that everyone agreed was nothing and found in it everything she needed and more than she could ever fully understand. Mabel had passed that knowledge to Clara the way the earth passes its heat to the surface, steadily, through the rock, without ceremony, available to anyone who knew where to stand and how to ask. Clara had carried it through 5 years of solitude and cold, and watching and the slow building of something that no one could see from the outside. She had brought it back to the people who had decided she was gone, and she had offered it without condition, which was the only way it could be offered, because that was what the land had taught her. The earth did not negotiate the terms of its warmth. It gave it to whoever needed it and knew how to receive it. She had spent 65 years learning where to find it. She had spent 65 years giving it away. And the fire deep below the Badlands, the fire that had been sleeping for 10,000 years before Mabel Runningwater found her first cave entrance and 40 years before Clara May Whitfield followed a line of steam into the broken country, continued to breathe its warmth up through the rock, steady and indifferent and ancient, completely unconcerned with the human stories occurring above it, completely unaware that it had saved anyone, simply doing what it had always done, burning.